Welcome to Watchtower History. There's a book, The German Churches and the Holocaust Betrayal. And there's a little blow up here that mentions the Jehovah's Witnesses and why they were persecuted in Germany. It says, finally, Jehovah's Witnesses used Hebraic language and customs, which associated them with Jews. And they did so without apology or willingness to change. This religious movement had already suffered discrimination in Germany prior to 1933, but it increased under Nazi rule. Adherents continued to distribute pamphlets and otherwise maintain their faith in opposition to government regulations, which left them open to imprisonment and or placement in concentration camps. They were never singled out for death, and they were always given an option to renounce their faith and avoid further persecution. Thus, they cannot be compared to Jews or other racial victims of the regime. However, Jehovah's Witnesses largely held to their faith in the face of trouble, and thus they represent a religious group that refused to endorse or to collaborate with the regime. In the new Ken Burns documentary, The United States and the Holocaust, the Jehovah's Witnesses are mentioned, and it says basically the same thing, that the Jehovah's Witnesses stood firm in their beliefs and that they were singled out.
Jews were to die because of who they were. The Nazis would also kill millions of non-Jews, Soviet POWs, Belarusians, Ukrainians, Poles, Russians, and Roma and Sinti peoples. They also locked away gay men and Jehovah's Witnesses because their faith forbade them from serving in any army or saluting any flag, including Hitler's.
One of the things people can easily forget about the Holocaust is that the core of it occurred in a fierce and short period of time. 3/4 of the victims of the Holocaust died in only 20 months.
And as we have shown, they had more similar ideas to Hitler's Nazi party than for the Jews themselves.
And that's what I was going to say. Here, a lot of people talking about the Jehovah's Witnesses who haven't been in it don't understand a lot about it. For a lot of these people who don't have family members or anything, who are just observing from the outside the information, don't fully grasp the whole narrative of what was really going on. And it shows in this sentence right here, which associated them with Jews. And they did so without apology or willingness to change. Well, the Declaration of Facts proves that statement otherwise. So they don't know what was really going on in the background, nor the belief, nor the history of it. And they're commenting on Jehovah's Witnesses. They didn't even get that one right.
Well, as much as I like Ken Burns' films, they're really amazing. On this particular point on Jehovah's Witnesses, and as this book also says, and as many others who deal with this history of the Jehovah's Witnesses, what they miss is the underlying racism, the underlying anti-Semitism that the religion was based off of.
Which and as we've shown, exact opposite of doing so without apology or willingness to change.
And so as we've shown, these anti-Semitic ideas that Watchtower was pushing were based on literal forgeries. And if they were based on forgeries, what really is the religion based upon? Ford was quite the idol of Hitler. This is where he was getting many of his ideas from. Ford and the Nazis blamed the Jews for the economic crisis in Germany after the First World War. If the Jews were manipulating the world's economy as Ford claimed, then they were an easy target to blame.
And again, the international Jew is brought up. I mean, everything is, the pieces of the puzzle are falling and fitting into place. And as we, again, not to repeat ourselves again, but if you look, They're in Hitler's office. Look, there's a picture of Henry Ford. Why would Hitler admire Henry Ford? Now, I could see, yes, he's a wealthy man. He's an industrialist. I want to bring Germany with that greatness into the world. But there's also a whole ideology that he's also quoting him on, which changes the whole context and aspect of things. And again, like with Watchtower, it's not just what they say, it's what they don't say, what they leave out of things. And sometimes it's what you leave out that's more important than what you are adding into it.
As we saw with Rutherford's declaration of facts to Hitler, he wasn't trying to ingratiate himself with Hitler. He was on the same page with Hitler. They had the same ideas from the same exact source.
Which recent articles are denying the whole context of it again, still. So apparently people are reminding them and they just keep denying the whole thing. It's sad. It's almost like a lot of the people who are Holocaust deniers. They literally just will not admit their part in that or that it happened to support their own ideology. And again, Watchtower is an ideology.
And finally, there's an interesting chapter in the Paranoid Apocalypse called The Protocols of the Elders of Zion on the Contemporary American Scene. Historic artifact or current threat? The Protocols, American Nuances. And remember, these things keep changing all the time. As they keep moving from one country to another, they get translated in other language. As a culture changes or the political scene changes, things get added to it, things get modified. It's different in the various countries of the world. Well, the Nazis persecuted the Masons as well. The Jehovah's Witnesses claim that since they were persecuted in Nazi Germany, that it proves they were the chosen ones. Well, the Masons and anyone the Nazis persecuted could have claimed exactly the same thing. This Professor Deborah Lipstadt says, beginning already with the publication of the International Jew, and increasingly in the decades thereafter, the protocols took on certain particularly American nuances. The attacks on Freemasonry, so prevalent in the European edition, were of far lesser importance in the United States. Why? Possibly because Ford was a Freemason. There were attacks on Freemasons, but not on the same extent as in other places. On the other hand, in American editions of the protocols and in literature exposing them, the theme of the Judeo-Bolshevism was dramatically highlighted. This was particularly true during the 1950s and 60s, during the height of the Cold War and the aftermath of the McCarthy era. It was during this period that the connection between the Jews and communism, as first portrayed in the protocols, gained an American life on its own. Again, I'm a skeptic. I need to track these things to their source. Why didn't Ford state anything about a Freemason conspiracy? The claim is that Ford was a Freemason. I don't believe these things until I can find the evidence for it. And so when I did a search, we found in the newspapers that Ford was indeed elected for Masonic honor. To the Scottish Rite, a 33rd degree Mason. This is not something they hide. This is something the Masons publish in all of the newspapers. So as stated earlier in the discussion, in 1905, Macmillan had visited Rutherford and was talking to him about the Bible student movement and the teachings at the time. And then he baptizes him in 1906. Well, we know that that time, in between that time, Rutherford becomes a member of the Odd Fellows. And the question in my mind was, well, why? When we started to look at the connections between Rutherford and William Jennings Bryan, it was interesting to note that Williams Jennings Bryan was also a member of the Odd Fellows. And so being friends, campaigning for him, he would have known he was associated with. I'm wondering if there was an influence there on Rutherford to join the Odd Fellows because of Bryan's connection there.
Well, again, you go back to dressing like him, picking up a lot of ideologies from him. He had to admire him to do all that. Yeah, I would say joining an organization because him thinking, oh, it's a club. Also, when you follow his sermons that Bryan was giving, ye are my witnesses. Where did he get the name Jehovah's Witnesses? Ye are my witnesses.
That is one of the possibilities. There's a possible connection there. We can't definitively say that is where it came from, but at least we could see how the scripture is used, not only by the British Israelites, Bryan, but also those who had similar ideas, like the white supremacists, who are also using the similar passages as well. So when also looking at William Jennings Bryan, we know that he was involved with the Masons as well. That was something that a lot of the politicians did at the time. They were involved with the Masons and with Odd Fellows and other fraternities like that. There's something interesting I learned from Barbara Anderson, who said that a lot of these type of societies were early forms of life insurance, that they would collect the dues from these different organizations, and that when somebody passed, they would be able to take up that collection for the individual and be able to give to the surviving spouse or family. Rutherford was not involved with the Masons. Whether or not Russell was, that is another discussion for another time and another deep dive that we want to do, just like we did with these Rutherford ideas. And we're going to look at where did Russell get his ideas from. Stay tuned for that. And during the 1924 Democratic National Convention, they had a question of whether or not the Klan should be involved. Bryan refused to take a stand against it. He didn't want to commend it. He didn't want to criticize it. And that's similar to what happened with Rutherford. When you see our discussion on Watchtower and the KKK, you see a lot of these connections with the Klan, radio time with the Klan, statements about the Klan. Well, if they're not against Watchtower, we're not against them. Well, why did they take such a stand? It's very, very similar to how Bryan is taking the stand on the Klan. And so with the similarities of Bryan's ideas, Bryan's doctrines, you see similarly that Rutherford's picking up the same ideals and bringing it into Watchtower.
Well, it would be like you looking at the Charles Manson murders, his followers who perpetrated the act with them. Okay. Would you hire one of them to work for you and then say, I don't support that's not right, what Manson and all them did. It's wrong, but have them in your association? The term guilty by association does go a long way. Yes, in Bryan's defense, would that affect votes? But then again, are you supporting a party that supports those ideas while you're claiming to be a Christian and a minister on top of that? Ye are my witnesses. So you really have to weigh your heart intent on that one.
It's possible that Bryan disliked the Klan, but then on the other hand, he never really came out and publicly spoke against it either. And so how far are you condoning the message, even a message you dislike, by not criticizing the message. So in 1925, the Klan became the first national organization to urge that both evolution and creationism be given equal time in the public schools. And so when Bryan was involved with the Scopes monkey trial, and that became a fleet United States wide national interest story on the cover of all the newspapers. Well, Bryan died 5 days after the trial. Klan burned crosses to eulogize Bryan because of
Now,
that
now my
position.
thought there, okay, you don't have a tribute to someone who doesn't think like you. Do you know what I'm saying? There had to be something in the background going on for them to consider him worthy of such a tribute. So that's, again, you can't prove it. It's an opinion, but why would the Klan burn crosses in his honor if he wasn't thinking like them or supporting them quietly in silence and gathering them, garnering them favors politically? So there's just a lot of evidence toward that.
There's some odd parallels in the lives of Bryan and Rutherford as well. Both of their wives learned German, and they were very involved in Germany for some odd reason. Mary Bryan learned German to help her husband's career. And if you remember, of course, peace ship with Ford, and they were trying to end the militarism, trying to end that First World War together. And of course, there's connections there that we mentioned as well already, with Rutherford using the similar title, the militarism, mentioning, this peace ship and the activities of Ford and Bryan trying to end the war. Another odd parallel between Bryan and Rutherford is that both were members of the Oddfellows. And remember, they thought Bryan was going to be the chosen one to try and save the United States. When he wasn't elected, when things didn't work out that the way that they thought, they moved on and they went down another path, the Democratic
And
Party.
remember, Rutherford himself quoted that Bryant was chosen by God for this assignment. Well, as we said before, Rutherford does believe in his head people are chosen by God to guide the government and guide events in the world.
And that's similar to the chosen concept from Calvinism. And remember, he was raised a Baptist. He was raised a Calvinist. Remember Macmillan's statement that said, those of us who grew up Calvinist have a hard time getting rid of those ideas. And so this idea of, Bryan being the chosen one, they thought that was, they thought that was going to be the way to save the United States. And it didn't work out the way that they thought. And so what Rutherford did next is then he thought, well, maybe Russell's the chosen one. Maybe he's fulfilling the scripture. Maybe this is the only way that the world could be saved, not just the United States. And so he followed that path for a while. But then Russell died. And in taking over, perhaps he thought he could help fulfill that position. Maybe he thought he was chosen.
And wait, I've got Russell's ideas from religion. And wait, Bryan's the chosen one politically. Mix the clay with the iron.
And so then he starts going down the path of taking all the various scriptures to show he's the chosen one. I went to prison. It's all about me. Taking every single scripture, type, Bible story, and applying it to Watchtower after 1918, 1919.
And most of the Bible students left because they did not believe it. So he had to recruit a whole new group of people who believed that the scriptures was Rutherford in fulfillment.
And who, Russell was already dead by the 1919 period. Rutherford's the only one taking the lead, and who's coming up with the ideas? Well, Rutherford was. He had to get rid of the editorial committee to do it. First, the 5 votes with Fisher, see our Man Who Dared Disfellowship Rutherford discussion, and see how the editorial committee had to be changed. They didn't need 5 votes unanimous anymore. They only needed 4. So that way they could remove the dissenting vote.
And again, he counted for 2 of them.
Yeah. Make sure you see that discussion for more on that. And all of this was because Fisher objected to Rutherford's sheep and goats judgmental doctrinal shift, which changed Watchtower into the judgmental juggernaut it is today. And then, with the Birth of the Nation article, he just decided to go around the editorial committee anyway. Now remember, we've covered this before. This Birth of the Nation article was only published and printed after the editors objected to it, simply because Rutherford went over the heads of the editorial committee to the point where he removed the editors completely. When Rutherford spoke of the editors' objections to this article a decade later, he literally called his own editors Satan and used that as the reasoning for why he had them being removed. This Birth of the Nation article is the one where Rutherford said everything was about his Watchtower after 1914 when Satan was cast out of heaven. This is where that idea is introduced. And he makes the entire 1914 idea all about him, the ideas he was bringing into Watchtower, and because he was claiming that Watchtower was God's chosen organization, and he was the one taking the lead of the organization. Therefore, he was the chosen one to lead the chosen one of the organization. So you step by step, you can see how he was pushing towards this idea of taking control, and the idea that perhaps he was the chosen one. I used to think that he was an opportunist, that he was just taking the opportunity, maybe you can make money. But I'm beginning to wonder now, knowing what we know from all of this, maybe he really believed it. Maybe that's why the people who followed him because I think they really believed it.
What's the most amazing part in this story is usually after such a charismatic individual like Rutherford dies, the organization breaks apart, goes away, and all that. Knorr must have really believed he was the chosen one and felt he needed to carry that work on to extent of unheard of. He outdid Rutherford in being Rutherford.
Yeah, and all of the governing body members following after that. I think they really believe it. But have they fact-checked the modern history of Jehovah's Witnesses? We have. Remember, Rutherford and Bryan were from the South. I think that's why, you could see some of that, the hints towards racism, towards the anti-Semitism, not only out of the Populist Party and the ideas that were coming out of that, Williams, Jennings, and Bryan, but also out of just the general attitude of many of those who lived in the South. Granted, everyone in the South didn't think that way and doesn't believe that way, but you can see how, taking a step back from the Klan, not criticizing it, leaving it on the platform of that political convention. And remember, Rutherford and Watchtower also failed to denounce the Klan and even sold radio time to them. In the film Inherit the Wind, the main character, Matthew Brady, is based off of real-life William Jennings Bryan, time presidential candidate, Bible scholar, and an opponent of the subject of evolution.
I object. On what grounds? Is it possible that something is holy to the celebrated agnostic? Yes. the individual human mind.
In real life, Bryan died right after the end of the trial. So, in the days following the Scopes Monkey trial, Bryan was delivering several speeches in Tennessee, died in his sleep from what is possibly a stroke. Bryan was so popular that a year after the 1924 Democratic National Convention, where Bryan refused to make a hard stance against the Ku Klux Klan, the Klan also wanted to be a part of the Democratic National Party. Bryan was a Christian fundamentalist, and the Klan in the 1920s was also claiming to be Christian fundamentalists, just like Bryan. So on August 8th, 1925, the Ku Klux Klan brought 30,000 members to Washington, D.C., 22 abreast and 14 rows deep, and they paraded down Pennsylvania Avenue. The date on this is interesting because this was August 8th, 1925. The Ku Klux Klan, not only in Washington, D.C., but in South Dakota, in Ohio, and other places, burned crosses as a memorial for William Jennings Bryan. Bryan's funeral was July 31st, 1925, just a week previous. And so the Klan used it as a means to try to promote their ranks.
Now here we go. Once again, another tie-in and another irony. Okay, the Klan, the Ku Klux Klan, is having a ceremony for Bryan, who was Rutherford's mentor, who admittedly, and even Time Magazine, as we showed from the Time Magazine article, looked up to, emulated, dressed like him. The Klan is throwing a bash for literally for that type of person. Would the Klan honor Malcolm X, Martin Luther King? No. Bryan.
And remember, this Democratic National Party convention in 1924 that we know Rutherford attended because Bryan was there. That's when the Democratic Party was considering bringing the KKK onto the Democratic platform. And of course, they didn't do it, but Bryan didn't criticize or condemn the Klan as he should have.
And
he was very soft on it.
And neither did Rutherford.
And neither did Rutherford. And Rutherford, just a few days later at the Watchtower Jehovah's Witness convention, literally having the same exact opinion. And remember, that was the same Democratic National Convention where Rutherford tried to convince Bryan again of his Watchtower theology. Can you imagine what the two were talking about? One of the newspaper articles about this at the time says, Rutherford failed to convert Bryan to Russellism, opposed to prohibition, but comes out in favor of bobbed hair. J.F. Rutherford, president of the Russellites, told the convention today that he had failed in an attempt recently to convert William Jennings Bryan to the belief of Pastor Russell that millions now living will never die. Bryan is on the wrong track and is doomed to failure in his efforts to reform the world, said Rutherford. The world needs enlightening, not reforming. I tried to win Bryan to our way of thinking while he was in New York at the Democratic Convention, but I don't think I got very far. Rutherford, successor to Pastor Russell, started a movement against statutory morality in a convention when he declared, morals cannot be enforced by law. I abhor liquor myself, but I am unequivocally against prohibition. It is certain to increase the rate of liquor rather than to decrease it. I am against anything that interferes with the personal rights of men. And of course, we know Rutherford was himself bringing in alcohol illegally from Canada, according to the testimony from Walter Salter. Well, remember what Rutherford had saved from 30 years previously from the Populist Party. Those ideas Bryan was pushing about the Rothschild conspiracies and the Jewish anti-Semitic conspiracies that Rutherford's bringing into the Watchtower theology here in the late 1920s and early 1930s. I'm sure, just like, where they suggested let's have Ford read Rutherford's book. I'm sure that's what Rutherford was talking to Bryan about. It makes perfect sense.
And it's funny, the evolution of Rutherford. In the beginning, he was following Bryan. Now, he's the chosen one. He thought, as Time magazine said, Bryan was the chosen one. Then he changes his mind. Oh, wait, I'm the chosen one. Bryan, you need to get on board with what I'm doing. So,
and we have similar ideas, right? Here's the ideas we had back in the Populist Party. Here they are again. But notice how they fit more with the Bible.
Yes.
And with me.
Exactly.